You are listening to the Navigating Adult ADHD podcast, where it's all about education, support, and coaching for adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Zena, a late diagnosed ADHDer, here to help you unpack the challenges, frustrations, and the positive side of living with ADHD. With my no BS approach, I'll help you to better understand your unique ADHD brain and how you can work with it to feel better, increase your self-confidence, improve your relationships, and ultimately achieve your goals. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Navigating Adult ADHD, where today I'm recording this from a very wet and windy office. I'm also going to warn you that it is school holidays and my partner has taken the boys out, but they're due home any minute. And I'm like, that could mean a lot of background noise all of a sudden before they get the message to keep it down. So let's see how we go. And if you are in the school holidays, I'm thinking of you. I am with you. Now, this episode is all about regulation. So this is a part 2. So last week we talked about how to identify when we are dysregulated. Okay, because emotional regulation for adults with ADHD, it involves 3 parts. And the first part is developing the awareness to be able to identify and name when we are dysregulated. Okay, now that is something that we can struggle with, especially if you've listened to the episode on interoception, where we can kind of have difficulties identifying the sensations and the signals that our body is sending us until we are, boom, exploding. Okay, so again, last week's episode is super important when it comes to being able to identify and know when we are dysregulated. And today we're going to talk about the second step, which everybody's dying to hear, which is how do you actually regulate yourself? Like, what do you do? How do you self-regulate? That's what we're talking about today. And I was thinking before I hit record, am I feeling regulated? I did like a check-in with my body and I was like, yes, I am feeling regulated, but I'm kind of bordering the edge of dysregulation. Like I'm kind of at that kind of, if you would think of a pot boiling, I'm like warm. I'm at the warm edge, and that is because things have not all gone to plan this morning. I'm running a little bit behind in the things that I wanted to get done today, and so I can just kind of feel that there. I'm very aware of that, which is relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so as we know, adults with ADHD, one of the executive functions that doesn't automatically function so well for us is emotional regulation. Now, have you ever just lost your temper and yelled at someone? I know I have. My friends, that is emotional dysregulation. So, being able to regulate ourselves is the ability to be able to recognize, understand, and effectively manage our emotions. Okay? That is what emotional self-regulation is. The ability to recognize, understand, and manage our emotions in a healthy and effective way. Okay? When we have challenges with emotional regulation, it can quite literally impact every single thing that we do. Okay? And I'm not just being dramatic. Trust me, I'm a dramatic person and I love that. But I am being very serious when I say it can and does impact everything that we do. Why? Because as we know from psychology, our emotions drive all of our actions, right? What we feel determines what we do. For example, when we are frustrated, say we're frustrated with our partner because he didn't get milk on the way home, we then become short and snappy and maybe we give them the silent treatment, okay? That's going to impact our relationship and probably we're going to have a pretty shitty night together. When we're anxious because our boss just sent us an email asking to have a chat later today, instead of carrying on with our work and, getting everything done, we're going to start double checking everything and panicking and then talking to our coworkers to ask if they know what that might be about and maybe gossiping and not be very productive. When we're afraid of having a difficult conversation with a friend, we're likely to avoid them and our friendship is probably going to grow apart. Okay. Again, our emotions drive all of our actions. What we feel determines what we do and what we don't do. Again, emotions are the reason that we procrastinate too. Okay. Emotions, my friend, are everything. And when we haven't developed that skill of emotional regulation, often what we do is we react to our emotions and we resist them. We kind of fight them, right? We are more likely to say or do things that we regret later. Things like yelling at the kids, or storming off when your coworker says something that you don't like, or jumping to conclusions when your friend hasn't texted you back. Okay? Again, this is all part of how we respond to our emotions. So, like I said last week, I'm going to say it again because I think this is so good. Just like you can't learn to swim by watching YouTube videos, you can't learn to self-regulate without being dysregulated. Okay, again, that's why step 1, which we really dove into in episode 82 last week, was how to identify when we are dysregulated. Now, I have got news for you, and then I've got really good news. So let's start with the really good stuff. The really good news is that emotional regulation, this is a skill that we can learn, right? As adults with ADHD, I promise you, we can learn how to regulate our emotions and how to practice this in our own lives. And on top of that, regulation itself, like the how we do it, is actually very simple. Okay? We'll get to that. Now the news, the news here is that this takes practice, meaning this is not another all or nothing thing. We're so all or nothing. It cracks me up. I say we because me too, my friend. Right? As ADHDers, we're often very all or nothing. But emotional regulation, it's not one of the things we're going to approach with all or nothingness. All right? Because we're not going to nail it every single time. Speaking from experience. Right? You are exercising a new muscle, and it's going to take some time to build it, to strengthen it. Okay? But it might just be one of the most life-changing skills that we ever develop. Again, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being very honest. The ability to regulate our emotions, okay, it's a skill, very simple, but it does take practice, and it literally has an impact that will, create a ripple throughout our entire life. Okay, again, we know our emotions drive all of our actions. What we feel is going to determine what we do and what we don't do. Therefore, this is huge. Okay, imagine being able to calm yourself down when you get angry instead of yelling. Or imagine that you're able to really dial back those intense feelings of overwhelm so that you can actually focus on what needs to get done and get things done. And imagine being able to soothe yourself when you feel anxious, being able to comfort yourself and have a healthy conversation with your partner instead of kind of spinning and going in circles and avoiding it, right? Now, here's some other good news. We've actually been regulating our emotions since we were born, although some of our strategies sometimes are not so healthy. They may do more harm than good. For example, like using alcohol to soothe ourselves, to comfort ourselves, or more to sort of numb, right? But if you think about back to when we were babies, right? We start regulating at a very young age. And babies, for example, suck their thumbs because it's comforting. So, as I said, you have been doing this your whole life without even realizing it was a skill. Well done. So, things like rocking in a chair or humming. Humming is one that, I used to do quite a lot, and I see now from people around me, people who I know are highly anxious people as well. I will often see them humming, right? And it may be like that at school, you would chew on a pencil, okay? All of those things are, again, regulating, helping us to soothe, to provide that comfort that we're wanting, right? Notice how all of those things are us trying to comfort ourselves. So the goal of regulation is to manage our own emotional responses. Now, I do want to be clear, I am actively working on this right now when it comes to one specific feeling. So I'm working on this throughout my entire life, of course, but frustration is one that I would say I have the most challenge with, right? Is when I feel frustrated. Now, I know that when I get frustrated, I become short and snappy. I'm sometimes not very nice. Right? I don't like who I become and how I act when I am frustrated. Now, if we come back to the 3-step format for a moment, we know step 1 is to identify when you are dysregulated. Sometimes I can do that when I'm frustrated, but not every single time. Sometimes I don't realize it until later, and therefore I haven't been able to regulate myself at the time. So again, I share this with you to drive home the point that this is not one of those things we're going to nail 100% of the time, every single time, right? And that's normal, okay? In fact, it's a big part of learning and really developing the skill. We want to approach this like we are an emotion scientist, okay? Rather than judging ourselves, one of the things I love to do is get really curious and just experiment on myself. Right? But it is a really great way to learn if we approach this as like a scientist and we're doing some experiments and running some labs and some tests. Rather than judging ourselves, we want to really learn what works, what doesn't work so well. Like, why is it that I didn't notice I was frustrated that time, but I did the time before? What's the difference there? Okay. Now, it's really important to understand that emotional regulation, okay, it is not about not feeling. Okay. Neither is it about like having really tight control over what we feel. Okay. It is about helping ourselves to create the safety we need to feel what we are feeling and respond in a healthy way. So I remember when I was very first learning to feel my emotions, and I would say I was probably, like 30, around that age. When I was first learning to feel my emotions, I was terrified of feeling some of them, especially like things like sadness or fear or self-doubt, because I was really afraid that if I felt them, if I let them in, that I would end up down this black hole and I would never come out again. And if I let myself feel them, that I would never achieve my dreams. I would just end up depressed. Okay? I didn't actually feel safe to feel those emotions, right? So I didn't want to let them in. I promise you that once you learn to feel them, they actually lose their power over you. And instead, it's like they hang around, these emotions that you can experience hang around more like a bad smell. And before you realize it, they've actually gone, right? The problem is how hard we fight to not feel bad. We put so much mental, physical, and emotional energy into that. Now, another thing that we need to understand here is emotional regulation is also not about ridding ourselves of all negative emotions. No, right? This is not about just feeling positive all of the time, right? That is not humanly possible. And that's the best news, my friend. Life truly is 50-50, right? Half the time you will experience positive emotions, half the time you'll experience negative ones. You're not doing it wrong. Okay, I have an entire episode where I talk about like the 50-50 of life and how I thought the goal in life was to be happy all of the time, but that's not actually humanly possible, right? Without being sad, how could we know and appreciate happiness, right? Without grief, how could we truly appreciate and know love, right? Without one, how could we know and appreciate the other? But also, there will always be things in the world we don't want to feel happy and good about. Right? Things like war and death and child trafficking and all of these awful things that happen in the world. We don't want to feel happy about them. Okay? So you're not doing it wrong if you feel bad. In fact, half the time, completely normal. What is the issue that we have here is that we haven't necessarily developed the safety to feel our feelings. And when we're able to create that safety to feel our feelings, I promise you it is literally life-changing. Okay? So, as we explored last week, when we are dysregulated, we are usually in a state of fight or flight. So that means that our brain has redeployed our precious resources. I wish you guys could see me. Total ADHD side note, right? My hands are going right now. I am doing hand gestures, showing you my brain and pushing out these resources. Such a shame we can't see each other, right? It's so fun. I just know that as you listen to this, I am fully dramatic with my hands going and painting pictures, and I'm really into it. All right. That's exactly how I talk. Very, very visual in the way in which I talk. All right. So back to where I was. So when we are in a state of fight or flight, right, which is typically when we're dysregulated, what happens is our brain redeploys our resources, things like the dopamine and the norepinephrine, all this sort of thing, and it sends them out to fight off a potential threat. Okay, because when we're in fight or flight, our brain's we're in danger. So it sends all of our precious resources, especially the things ADHD brains have less of, off to fight this potential threat. So what that means is it makes it very hard, almost impossible, to learn new things, to be able to focus, especially on small tasks or mundane things, right? It makes it very difficult to engage with other people and have a productive conversation, because certain parts of our brain have been sent off and redeployed, shall we say, to survival, to fighting off this potential threat. Okay? So this is why this skill, this ability to self-regulate, is so important. It also helps us to understand why kids or even adults who don't feel safe at school or in any environment just can't learn. Right? Because if they are in a state of fight or flight, their brains are just busy trying to stay alive. Makes so much sense. Now, our ADHD brains, they often spend a lot of time in fight or flight when they don't necessarily need to. And I say that hesitantly because it's very well-meaning. Our brain is trying to protect us when it goes into this fight or flight. And as people with ADHD living in a neurotypical world, a world that is not designed for us, and we're trying to, fit in and be a part of this society and this world that's, not necessarily ours, that can feel quite threatening. That can feel unsafe. That can be difficult. So to me, it makes so much sense that our brains go to this state of fight or flight so often. Okay? So let me give you an example of what this might look like. If you get that email, right, from your boss that says, hey, we're going to have a chat later, and you're just sitting in your office, okay, you're in your cubicle in your office, you're completely safe, right? That when you get that email, you open it and you read it and you start to panic, that is when you go into fight or flight. Now, there's no man running at you with a knife. There's no lion in the office. You are safe. You're in your office, you're just reading an email and making an assumption about it, okay? So that's technically not a life or death situation. But when our brain responds by going into that state of fight or flight, that's when we become dysregulated, we become less productive, right? And that is when life can become pretty difficult for us, okay? It's like we turn up the difficulty setting. So the $1 million question that we've all been waiting for is, how do we actually regulate ourselves? And like I said earlier, this is actually incredibly simple. It is very, very simple. Okay. The hard part is actually being able to identify and say, 1, I am dysregulated. And then 2, taking 30 seconds or a few minutes to use a tool that will help us to regulate. Okay. So before I share with you some of mine, I want to say, what are the things that you do now in your life that help you to calm down, that help you to soothe yourself, or that help you to be present? What are those things? So for me, I know that walking in nature helps me to calm down, and it also helps me to be present. I know that bouncing on my rebounder, I've got one of those little mini trampolines. I've only had it maybe a month now. I'm friggin' obsessed. so am. But bouncing on that is like shaking out, like, I don't know how to explain it, like shaking out negativity. I don't know, but just shaking it out really helps me to take the intensity of any emotions I have and dial them right back. The physiological sigh, which is a double inhale followed by a long exhale, and I'll link a video to that in the show notes. Doing that is also one of my go-tos. Okay. Now, the number of specific strategies for regulating our emotions is nearly limitless, right? There are thousands of them, right? And it will depend on the situation that we're in and the emotions that are involved as to which tool we want to use. And that will vary for each of us. If you are physically rushing, I can't, what's the word I want? Emphasize. I'm so proud of my brain. It found it. I thought we're going to go off on a tangent, but I found it, right? Back to what I was saying. If you are physically rushing, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to physically slow down, okay? Because that physically rushing is feeding the dysregulation. The slowing down is helping you to literally slow your body down, okay? I also want to say, be intuitive, right? Try things that help you feel calmer, that help you to soothe and be more present. And no doubt you will have already experienced this if you take some time to sort of reflect on it. And here's what I know for sure. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach, okay? So I'll share with you some of the things I do. For example, when I am anxious, if I feel anxiety, or anytime I'm overwhelmed, which doesn't happen for me often, but if it does, right? Anxiety and overwhelm, I know that EFT tapping is the tool that I need. Now, got a whole podcast on that. I'll link to it in the show notes. You can also go through a video of me walking you through how to do it. It's specifically for anxiety, okay? But you can change it out to whatever you're feeling. But I know if I am anxious and I use EFT tapping, it will have a profound impact on how I feel every single time. It just blows my mind because I'm not a woo-woo person, and to me it's a little bit woo-woo, but that shit works, my friend. I kid you not. Now, when I'm nervous, okay, when I'm going to, say, speak on a stage and I'm feeling nervous, I know that the tool I need is the physiological sigh. I need to focus on breathing and breathing deeper into my belly and, forcing myself to do that exhale and show my brain and body, hey, we're not in danger, we can dial it back. Now, it doesn't make my nerves or my fear disappear completely, but it makes it more manageable. I'm able to regain control of my brain to sort of think logically and act more logically instead of being more reactive, okay? When I feel frustrated, bouncing on my tramp is awesome. Or, especially with music on, like putting on a song and bouncing it out to a song that I love, just one song, right? A couple of minutes, that's all it takes. Or if I've got the time, if I can go for a walk, just even a short walk around the block. Or for me, lying on the floor, and sometimes I'll just put my hand on my belly and breathe deeply, like especially if there's some sunshine, things like that. Those are all going to help me to dial back the intensity on that emotion, okay? Now, the fun part here is that you get to try lots of different ways to regulate your emotions based on things you enjoy, based on things that have worked for you in the past, on things that you feel drawn to try. The hard part, though, and I just want to emphasize this, okay? The hard part is being able to name what you're experiencing and then actually taking the time, deliberately taking 30 seconds or a couple of minutes to actively regulate, to actively use one of these tools. Okay, so much of my coaching that I do with my clients is on helping them to actually press pause when they feel it and use one of these things. Because every single time they use one of these things, it helps. It makes a wild difference. But often I got to coach them on actually using one of these things in that moment. Okay, now, speaking of intensity, I know I've said like dial the intensity back a few times. I just want to kind of explain what I mean by that. So often I'll have people rate their emotions on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being like extremely intense. Say you're feeling anxious, like 10 out of 10 anxiety is like as much as you could possibly feel, the worst you've ever felt it, right? So when you're experiencing an emotion, and let's just say you've got 10 out of 10 anxiety, if you're able to dial that back to say a 6 out of 10 on a scale, you're able to function and think so much clearer. You're able to, instead of trying to sort of fight that off and just being so obsessed with getting rid of that feeling and trying not to feel that way and being very reactive and all over the place, when you're able to take it from a 10 out of 10 and dial it back to say a 6 out of 10, that is huge, because then you can think clearly, think logically, make a plan, decide what you need to do, who to ask for help, what have you, right? It makes a huge difference. So that's what I mean when I talk about like dialing that intensity back. Okay. And that's what emotional regulation helps us do, is it doesn't necessarily get rid of the emotion. Sometimes it will, but if it dials it right back, it dials it back enough for us to feel safe to feel and to make decisions about what's next. And generally that's when it starts to kind of dissipate from there. Okay. Now, I also use and teach thought diffusion tools. And we could have multiple podcasts on that, but I'm not going to go into that. But thought diffusion is another really powerful way to help yourself regulate. Okay, I help my clients to do that. I also want to touch on music. Okay, because if you listen to music or if you play a musical instrument yourself, perhaps you've noticed how much a certain song, maybe a song from like your childhood or your teenage years, how that can impact the way that you feel, right? For me, like anytime I hear like a Paul Simon song, you might not even know who Paul Simon is. Doesn't matter, right? I can't even think of one to try and like sing it out for you. Trust me, that's probably a good thing. Let's be honest. But anyway, anytime I think of like I hear a Paul Simon song, it always takes me back to this moment where my parents and I were driving out in the country, and I think we were going to get some calves, and we were in this old beat up Holden ute that we had. It was like a poo brown coloured HQ ute, and I'm pretty sure we were going to get some like baby calves to take home because my parents had a farm, and we had a tape deck in that ute, and we were playing this Paul Simon tape, and I loved it. It was like my favorite thing. Anyway, back then when you had these tape decks, it like chewed the tape up and it spat it out, and like it like the tape that wound out of it or whatever was like everywhere, and it was destroyed, and I cried all the way home, and I'm talking like a good hour-long trip. It must have been like 5 years old. But it always brings me back to that moment. And I'm reminded of the moment where my brother heard that this had happened, and he didn't live with us, but when he came to visit, he gave me the Paul Simon tape to play because he had it, and he gave it to me because he knew how much I loved it. And I'm just like, oh, it was so nice. But notice, right? The whole point of that is to notice how certain music, certain artists will influence how you feel in a positive way and maybe even in a negative way too. Okay. And there are studies that actually talk about this, and specifically for ADHD, there are studies that show that both listening to music and actually playing our own instruments can improve our mood and can help with emotional regulation. Awesome, right? So music is another tool. Now, exercise is one that I am massive on, and especially when you learn about like how big of an impact it can have on your brain and body. So one of the parts of the brain that is responsible for our intense emotions that we experience is the amygdala, okay? And that is home of our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, okay? So when I talk about fight or flight, there's actually a few of them, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawn is where you like people please and you kind of like pander to their needs. And then fib is where you try and lie your way out of it, okay? So that's the fifth one. So anyway, this part of our brain, right, responsible for these intense emotions, when it's activated, it floods our body with hormones and chemicals and things that actually urge us to take action, to take one of those actions like to fight or to flee, etc. Even if the rational part of your brain knows that you are like sitting in your home office and you're completely safe and there's no danger, right? You're not in a life or death situation. Even if your brain knows that, it can't take back the flood of chemicals that it just sent out to your body, all right? So you can either engage in a regulation activity to help them subside. You can wait a while to see if they can subside. The trouble with that is often we add fuel to the fire by, thinking about it and making it worse and like flooding our body with more of these chemicals. Speaking from experience. Or you can kind of trick your body into calming down by giving it what it wants, and that is exercise. Okay? Magical. Now, this doesn't have to mean you go for a 30-minute run or you do an hour weight session at the gym. It can literally be that you go for a 5-minute power walk around the block. Okay? It could mean that you get off your chair and you just do a minute of jumping jacks, or you could do like some squats and some lunges and some different things just for a couple of minutes, just to trick your body into thinking that it's using all of these chemicals and getting them out of your system, right? Hopefully I explained that. I think I did that. I'm going to say I nailed it. Anyway, I get very excited by the research, so I could keep going. We're not going to, okay? What I have found is that when we start to practice and develop this skill, when we start to practice identifying our emotions and we start to practice regulating them, right? And of course, step 3, which we identified last week, which is the self-care, okay? Which is like making sure we're getting adequate sleep, enough physical activity, moving our body, a good variety of nutrients in our diet, right? When we practice this and develop the skill over time, we begin to actually naturally incorporate more of these into our lives, okay? They kind of become something that we do. They become kind of, what's the word? I don't want to say habits. There's another word, but that kind of a thing. They become like a habit, something that we do frequently. And with that, they become more automatic, okay? These things start to become more automatic. We become able to go, oh, I'm dysregulated, I know to do this, right? It becomes kind of more on an autopilot as opposed to us having to do it manually. What that means, and I'm talking about this happens over time, okay? What that means is we become calmer and we become less reactive to our emotions as a result, all right? This has been my experience. And it is the experience of so many of the ADHDers that I have and have had the pleasure of working with, all right? Regulation work is the foundation of thriving with ADHD. When we're able to get ourselves out of fight or flight, we've got more access to our rational brain, to the part of the brain that we want, right? The part that, can think logically and plan and prioritize and take action and respond in healthy ways, right? Effectively, being able to self-regulate, this skill that we can develop, that we need to practice, it helps us to be more productive and it actually helps us to enjoy our lives more. I promise. So later today or tomorrow, when you next notice that you are dysregulated, that is a win, all right? You nailed step 1 in the moment when it's happening. So after that, the next step is to engage in a regulation activity. Take a couple of minutes, go for a walk around the block, or use the physiological sigh, okay? Play your favorite song and dance it out, even though you don't feel like dancing. I promise you'll be glad you did, right? If you're in your office, maybe go to the boardroom. It's up to you. I mean, if you want to dance it out with your colleagues, I'm all for it. Now, if you've got anxiety, then I definitely want to encourage you to watch my EFT tapping video. I'll link it in the show notes. You click on it, I just walk you through doing it, okay? Now, one last thing. Once you've done this, don't stop, okay? Keep collecting these wins. Keep going. Keep noticing you're dysregulated. That's a win. And then taking a few minutes to actively use a regulation tool, okay? After a couple of weeks, you are going to notice a visible difference in how you feel, all right? And very last thing, I want to celebrate with you. I want to invite you to share your regulation wins with me. Come and hang out over on Instagram. I will link it. I think it's navigating.adult.adhd, the same name as this podcast. Send me a message, direct message me. Tell me what you were feeling and tell me how you helped yourself to soothe, calm, comfort that emotion. Tell me about your experience. I would love to hear from you. I really would. All right. And I want to celebrate your emotional regulation wins. All right. So go out there, get dysregulated, so that you can practice the skill, you can accumulate these wins, and you can learn how to regulate yourself. All right, you've got this, my friend. Huge love. I'll speak to you next week. If you are loving what you're learning here on the podcast, but you still feel like your ADHD is holding you back, I can help. Using evidence-based coaching tools and my own experiences, I'll help you to manage your emotions and feel better, to increase your productivity, grow your self-confidence, and create the life that you were meant for. Visit zenajones.com/thrive and schedule an ADHD support session to get started.